Sergio Aguero, that's the man who many believe rubber-stamped the greatest title race and best season in English football history. But there's a crowd in the shadows, slightly stubbled, world-weary, rings around the eyes. They're of the football didn't start in 1992 brigade, and whenever Aguero's goal against QPR gets mentioned, they're liable to creep out from underneath their shadows and whisper, "Michael Thomas, 1989, into your earhole." But after today, neither will be making such derisory arguments. The following film will explain why the greatest season in English football is not the 2011-12 campaign, when of its stunning denouement at the Etihad Stadium. It will explain that no, not even Michael Thomas's winner in the greatest title showdown in English football history between Arsenal and Liverpool is enough to award the 1988-89 season as the craziest. No, today we're going back to the 1971-72 season and its four-way struggle to crown a champion of England, its all-English final in Europe, and its old firm teams nearly dominating the continent. English football hadn't completely left behind the previous season, and before everybody could breathe, the 1971-72 campaign was upon us. The previous year's title was a toss of the coin between Leeds United of the North and Arsenal of North London, but the whereabouts of the championship was formed thanks to a team from the Midlands. In a home tie with West Bromwich Albion that Don Revie's Leeds were expected to win, they fell to a 2-1 shock defeat. Shock by way of the scoreline, but even more gobsmacking was the manner of the defeat. The referee wholesale refused to believe the assistant's offside flag and waved through West Brom to score a second goal at Elland Road as the Leeds United defence stopped. Whether or not the goal should have stood remains up for debate. Sympathies for Leeds can be removed thanks to their inability to play to the whistle, regardless of the attacker's positioning, but can be reinstated thanks to the miscommunication between the officials. The fallout directly impacted the season we are here to talk to you about today. The denial to accept the decision led to pitch invasions, and the subsequent supporters' unrest at Elland Road was punished as the FA ruled that Leeds should play 4 home matches in the following season away from Elland Road. That match wasn't the ultimate decider for the title's destination, but it certainly played a part. The match which sealed the championship was a North London derby of all matches, where confusion over the goal average rule reigned supreme. Goal difference is nice and simple. Subtract the goals you've conceded from the goals you've scored, and that number is your score for a potential tiebreaker should points be level. Goal average, however, operated differently. That number was the amount of goals scored divided by the amount of goals conceded. For example, had the 1988-89 season been ruled on goal average, Liverpool would have won the title as they averaged 2.3214, whilst Arsenal's goal average would have totaled 2.0277. Aside from not having to bring a calculator onto the terraces, goal difference promoted more attacking play. Case in point, 1971. A goalless draw would be enough for Arsenal to limp over the line, whilst a score draw paradoxically wouldn't be enough. A win would make things far more cut and dry in the haze of confusion and controversy that already underpinned the season. Thankfully for most involved, Ray Kennedy's goal settled the title. The goal difference rule would only be introduced to English football 6 years later, but it wouldn't cushion the blow that if Leeds drew at home to West Brom, as many thought they should have done, then the Yorkshire club would have taken the championship on goal average. And thanks to the punishment meted out by the FA, as well as Leeds' inferior away form, one decision ostensibly could be seen to have cost 2 league titles in one fell swoop. Even the act of raising the curtain on the season wasn't simple in this, the greatest season in English football history. The curtain raiser duties were split between the multi-team Watney Cup and the Charity Shield. The former saw a famous result for Halifax Town against Manchester United, whilst 4th Division Colchester United stunned West Bromwich Albion in the final. Kind of like an Emirates Cup, but shunned of any type of esteemed or over-commercialisation. The Charity Shield, unlike today, was not mandatory. Therefore, double winners Arsenal opted out and chose to play 2 matches against a Benfica team that still contained the legendary Eusebio. It wasn't that the FA couldn't outmaneuver the quandary of the league winners and cup winners being the same team, as they had made amends when Tottenham had won both competitions a decade prior. In the end, second division champions Leicester City wound up beating FA Cup finalists Liverpool by a single goal. Then and only then could the curtain be raised and we could bask in the warm and glorious sunlight of the 1971-72 season. Everton Football Club were champions of England merely 15 months ago under Harry Catterick, but they had since suffered a collapse in fortunes. Brian Le Bon's injuries had plagued a poor defence of their title. The Toffees slipped to 14th in the league and came unstuck deep into cup competitions against Panathinaikos in the European Cup quarter-final and against local rivals Liverpool in the FA Cup. Both their opponents would reach the final. Added to Le Bon's injury woes, new signing Henry Newton had struggled to fit into the team, and the time was now or never for things to improve under Catterick. It was a source of maddening frustration at Goodison Park that their only victories in the first 3 months of the 71-72 campaign all came against big names who had all tasted success in recent times. Falling underneath Everton were as follows: Chelsea, winners of the Cup Winners' Cup and FA Cup as recently as 1970. Manchester United, England's first European champions in 1968. Arsenal, the reigning double winners. Newcastle United, winners of the Fairs Cup in 1969. And Liverpool, multiple-time league winners and FA Cup winners under Bill Shankly. Their inconsistencies were owed to a career cut painfully short as Brian Le Bon finally tapped out after his Achilles problems reared their ugly head once more, and his storied time at Goodison Park was over. He was their first king. Their second, Alan Ball, who was captain in Le Bon's absence but was abruptly sold to Arsenal for a staggering $220,000 in the build-up to Christmas. Mystery surrounded the departure. Rumours on the grapevine was that the World Cup winners' gambling debts needed to be serviced by a signing-on bonus, whilst others claimed a training ground bust-up hastened his exit. Or, as Alan Ball claims, it was simply business initiated by the manager. Upon the sale, Ball's former teammate Joe Royle retrospectively pointed to that exact moment when the great Evertonian era was over. And the third king wouldn't last too much longer. Harry Catterick, the last manager to win the English League with a defensive 3 until 2017. He suffered a heart attack just weeks after losing Ball to Arsenal. Whilst he would return to the Goodison dugout, he was understandably never the same again, and by the end of the subsequent season, AEK Athens manager Billy Bingham was placed in charge. A dismantling process was taking place up at St James's Park as the 1969 Fairs Cup winning squad was being broken up. Pop Robson was sold to West Ham with a canny replacement of John Tudor quickly coming in. Wyn Davies was sold to Manchester City with Terry Hibbitt and Malcolm McDonald drafted in to fill his void. The latter was likened to Jackie Milburn and expected to hit the ground running in the North East. To say he did so would be an underestimation. It took just 3 matches for the striker affectionately known as Super Mac to make his mark in Newcastle by netting a hat-trick at St James's Park against Liverpool. Form such as that simply had to grab the attention of the England manager, and Sir Alf Ramsey made McDonald the first Newcastle-capped England player for a generation. All the early promise, largely enacted by Supermac, was squandered in October as the Toon lost 5 on the bounce and found themselves propping up the entire division. 2 more defeats straddled the new year at home to the freshly promoted Sheffield United and the upwardly mobile Wolves. The New Year's resolution was clear: gain some form, and Newcastle did so with an unbeaten run that was only slain in mid-March by a suddenly rampant Liverpool at Anfield. In the interim, Newcastle United had wedged themselves firmly safe in mid-table, dropping just 2 points in 8 matches, and it is the 11th place they occupied after defeat on Merseyside that they would be housed in come the end of the season. Supermac's 30-goal campaign was inarguably the catalyst for the entire team, yet it wasn't the achievement that many were discussing in relation to Newcastle United and the 1971-72 season. The entire season was moved aside for the saga that was the greatest FA Cup match in history, Newcastle United versus Hereford United. The staging of the match was a saga in of itself. Non-league Hereford, despite rarely winning the Southern League and never being successfully elected to the Football League, found themselves in a 17th consecutive FA Cup season after eliminating Cheltenham Town 3-0 in qualifying. Hereford needed a replay to dispatch of Kings Lynn in the first round in front of 7,700 at Edgar Street. That had slightly swollen to 8,331, but this time at the Hawthorns in a second replay against Northampton Town in the second round. Then to January the 15th, where Newcastle United were retrieved from the hat to play Hereford at St James's Park. The initial encounter was called off thanks to a waterlogged pitch. 9 days and another postponement later, the match was finally on. In this day and age, there'd be graphics totalling up the wages and transfer fees for the big hitters against the minnows. Here there was the knowledge that Newcastle's team made up of 6 international stars, whilst the best thing Hereford had going for it was their 5,000 travelling supporters squeezed inside the 39,000 in attendance in the northeast. The last time Newcastle had faced non-league opposition, it didn't go too well. They'd been put out at the same stage by Bedford Town 2-1 8 years prior. Of all people, it was player-manager Colin Addison who dredged the game to a replay with a thunderbolt outside the box. The replay was finally played on February the 5th after 3 more postponements, where Newcastle United simply gave up going back home and housed themselves in a Worcester hotel for nearly 2 weeks. In the end, the game simply had to be played on the weekend allocated for 4th round matches on a disgrace of a pitch at Edgar Street. With more esteemed 4th round ties such as Liverpool versus Leeds United, the more renowned commentators of the time found themselves at the more important games. Therefore, a 26-year-old John Motson found himself with the microphone. By the end of proceedings, the match launched his career, and the match strong-armed its way to the front of the Match of the Day billing for 14 million viewers to see. 16,000 souls crammed inside Edgar Street to see the immortal extra-time winner of Ronnie Radford. Hereford didn't make the most of it though, eliminated after another replay against West Ham, where Jeff Hurst scored his final professional hat-trick. Yet it is based on this cup run that Hereford, second place in the Southern League, were elected to the Football League in Barrow's place, as Chelmsford City, the Southern League winners, remained in non-league in perpetuity. Brian Clough's Pretenders thought that they had found their place in the top flight, finishing 4th in 1970, but that star had dwindled somewhat by 5 places by the following year. Big moves were made for Colin Todd, replacing the talismanic Dave Mackay, and the club started the season unabashed and undefeated, albeit drawing a few too many matches. They ended September as the last unbeaten club standing, but their record could also be construed as merely 4 wins from the first 10. That run would end in Game 13, losing at Old Trafford, and although they added to that with 4 further defeats on the road before the turn of the year, the club stopped drawing matches and began to pick up more regular victories. Big victories as well against the might of Arsenal, Manchester City, Everton and Chelsea, which maintained the Rams' place behind the pace setters of Leeds United and both Manchester clubs. Brian Clough proclaimed a New Year's resolution with the visit of Chelsea to the baseball ground. Simply put, his team needed to toughen up away from home. In the immediate weeks thereafter, they won at the Dell, netted thrice at Upton Park as the points were shared before a loss at Highbury. Perhaps the loss in North London was merely down to the fact that they were sick of playing Arsenal after their 5th round FA Cup bout went 3 matches in the same period. Contrastingly, however, was Derby County's home form. It was simply pristine. Chelsea and Coventry City were beaten by a single goal in January before Nottingham Forest were thrashed by 4 and more Midland spoils were taken from Wolves. Only a second away win in 4 months came next at White Hart Lane, this in the midst of an 8-match unbeaten run well into April. Suddenly, Derby County could be classed as a contender. Tottenham Hotspur were always fancied to do well, always stocked by great goal scorers. Martin Shivers had taken on the Jimmy Greaves mantle to an absolute T, and added to his appetite in front of goal was the maturing of Steve Perryman and the signing of Ralph Coates. Undoubtedly, Spurs were a brilliant cup team, as testified by their current holding of the League Cup, and were tipped to be there or thereabouts in the Championship stakes. And that trend proved throughout the first half of the season. Spurs were impeccable in the League Cup as they ousted West Brom, Torquay, Preston and Blackpool to make the semi-finals against Chelsea. So too, away from home in the UEFA Cup, winning in almost record-breaking fashion in Iceland with an aggregate score of 15-1. Nantes and Rapid Bucharest were put to bed thereafter before European football followed suit for the winter. They maintained a spot in the FA Cup throughout the winter as well, as Carlisle United, Rotherham and Everton had no option but to surrender their spot in the competition to the might of Spurs. And yet in the league they were as inconsistent as they come. They would be humiliated at Main Road one week before dispatching Liverpool of the next. They'd go on enormous goal-scoring streaks, slapping 4 beyond Wolves, 6 past Forest and routing Everton 3-0, but sandwiched it between defeats against Stoke and Coventry. What's worse is that they were preparing themselves to wave goodbye to an all-time great. Alan Mullery hobbled off in the aforementioned loss against Stoke. It proved a whirlwind season for Mullery as he moved out on loan to Fulham, only to return at the business end of the season at White Hart Lane. More on that later. The old gold was back. 4th place in the previous season finally marked a return to European competition and the UEFA Cup for Wolves. Much like Spurs, Wolves were incredibly good value as a cup team, but without the esteem of hopes and dreams in the league. They were thoroughly expected to be best of the rest. However, despite the uptick in form, Wolves were still counting the cost of losing arguably their star player in bizarre fashion. Peter Knowles was quickly becoming their most integral player, but just as the 70s loomed, he wouldn't make it. The 23-year-old had been gripped by the Bible on a club tour of America and received an epiphany that curtailed his footballing career. He realised that his life of excess was unbecoming and, before the start of the 1969-70 season, foreshadowed his retirement by alluding to a severe lack of ambition. Within 8 matches, he would fulfil that promise, and although the club retained his membership until 1982, Knowles would return each contract unsigned. Only when he turned 36 did the club give up the ghost. Knowles had become a Jehovah's Witness, as Wolves struggled to knock on the doors of elite English football with a supremely difficult start to the season that factored in fixtures against Spurs, Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester City and Manchester United in the first 5. But in Europe, Wolves found their calling card, comfortably disposing of Portugal's Académica and the Netherlands' FC Den Haag. Karlsruhe Jena of East Germany came a little more difficult, but a vital 1-0 win behind the Iron Curtain sealed Wolves' place on the continent for after Christmas. Once Europe was put away for the winter, Wolves embarked on a dizzying run either side of Christmas that propelled them back into the top 6 reckoning. They'd thrash Arsenal 5-1 and claim wins over West Brom, Stoke, Leicester, Newcastle and Man United, as well as earning a point at home to Liverpool. Before any delusions of gate-crashing the title race could manifest, however, a 5-2 thrashing at Main Road brought the club down to earth. Yet still, they were on course in Europe. It was a year of change at the top for the 1968 champions of England. Manchester City had some enormous cup pedigree, but like Wolves were expected to merely settle as one of the best of the rest in the First Division. Their disappointing mid-table finish was owed in part thanks to an unfortunate glut of injuries at Main Road to Colin Bell, Alan Oakes and Mike Summerby. Meanwhile, tension between those in management, Joe Mercer and Malcolm Allison, had threatened to spill over. They began the season with that good old Manchester City inconsistency, in spite of Francis Lee's propensity for a goal. The English forward netted 6 in the first month, half of those penalties, and he would go on to convert a record 15 penalties, 100% of the spot kicks that the club were awarded throughout the season. Only when Colin Bell returned from injury in a 4-0 routing of Spurs, however, did City kick on, a welcome break from the torment of the earlier season. September was a fine month and was inclusive of a thrilling League Cup progression against Wolves, as well as victories over in-form Liverpool and Newcastle United at Main Road. And yet they would ultimately disappoint, shocked 3-0 away at Bolton in the League Cup before going down at the same stage of the FA Cup to Middlesbrough after a replay. In between the two fixtures, however, much had changed at Main Road. Malcolm Allison assumed sole control of the club's management, even if Joe Mercer remained at City with the official title of club manager. Allison, though, was quick to marginalise him. The club also went a chairman change as Eric Alexander became the youngest chairman in the division after his father retired. After defeat at Elland Road, Malcolm Allison's team soon captured the imagination. They ended Sheffield United's short-lived run at the top, were involved in an entertaining 3-3 draw at home in the Manchester derby, as well as picking 2 precious points at each of Highbury, Upson Park and the Victoria Ground. By the turn of the year, City were in a title hunt, just 3 points behind Manchester United, and as was his nature, Malcolm Allison declared himself confident of overturning the deficit because such a bad team was atop the table. Quickly they climbed to the top with wins over Palace and Wolves, with the partnership of new signing Wyn Davies and Francis Lee working an absolute dream. Only for Davies to fail in his search to find the net in 16 successive games thereafter. Still, contributions from Lee as well as Colin Bell kept the club ticking over. The latter's double-header against West Brom sent City 4 points clear as late as March. Then the long-desired Rodney Marsh became a Manchester City player. Joe Mercer had pushed back on Allison's desire to sign the QPR player for the past 2 years and balked at a £140,000 fee during the summer. Allison, though, craved Marsh's celebrity. Across town he saw United pulling in enormous crowds despite their inefficiency on the pitch, while City played the more attractive football yet couldn't entice supporters into Main Road. QPR noted City's desperation and sold the player to Malcolm Allison for an inflated £200,000. Many claim it was the signing that cost Manchester City the league. Like any good empire, life after the retirement of a totemic figure was rough. This was true for Sir Matt Busby, Old Trafford and Manchester United. Celtic manager Jock Stein had verbally agreed to join United in the summer of 1971 before realising that the youth prospects at Celtic would bring about an exciting rebuild up north. Therefore, United latched on to Leicester City manager Frank O'Farrell. The squad was living on former glories, the Holy Trinity was still intact and only 3 signings were made in 7 years. The only notable change was the retirement of Paddy Crerand, with the Irishman making his final appearance in the dismal Watney Cup performance against Halifax Town in pre-season. O'Farrell was quick to boost George Best's wages to that above his peers, and whilst he scored 26 goals throughout the season, there wasn't a lasting positive impact of old. Best started the season by escaping punishment for swearing at a referee, a sign of things to come. United were another team docked home matches for violent incidences in the prior season. So in their first home match, it was at Anfield against Arsenal before at Stoke's Victoria Ground played host to their second. In this time, United tallied up 2 3-1 victories, a slightly better record than Leeds in their home games away from home. Despite having to pay each of Liverpool, Stoke and West Brom compensation for gate receipts, United went on a tear through the autumn, dropping just 1 point in 8 games, and that was in a return to Anfield, this time truly away against Liverpool. In those fixtures, George Best netted a hat-trick at home to West Ham, as well as goals in each of the 4 triumphs after the draw at Anfield. It also didn't do any harm that Dennis Law had forced his way back into the team. Best's form, along with United's though, would fizzle out by Christmas. He had faced death threats from the IRA, which hampered his international game and ultimately pulled the plug on his Northern Ireland career. Then United's season tanked in the new year as the Northern Irishman went AWOL. At the start of December, United had a 5-point lead between a 3-2 win at home to Nottingham Forest on December the 4th and March the 11th's 2-0 triumph over Huddersfield. United wouldn't win a single league game. They were out of the title race and would eventually finish 10 points off the pace in 8th. Of the run, Bobby Charlton declared that players were doing their own things and lambasted a lack of cohesion and confidence. The league table for the calendar year of 1971 read United top on 59 points, only one less than their title triumph of 1966-67, a campaign that spurred the club on to win the European Cup. And yet, they had nothing to show for it. February 1970's FA Cup encounter between Watford and Liverpool, although a defeat for the latter, lubricated their future success. It was the day that Bill Shankly was now convinced that he had to initiate a rebuild of his successful 1960s team that won 2 championships, an FA Cup, and reached the semi-finals of the European Cup. They'd finished 5th in successive seasons after the Watford defeat, but had successfully replaced Tommy Lawrence in goal with Ray Clement, integrated Larry Lloyd into the defence, Steve Highway and Phil Thompson into midfield, whilst the signings of John Toshak and Kevin Keegan was about to blossom into a beautiful relationship in attack. It took Keegan just 12 minutes to score Liverpool's first goal of the season against Nottingham Forest, and both frontmen would find the net in a fruitful first month for 4 wins from 5. But thereafter, Liverpool couldn't sustain any run of any note until after Christmas. Victories against the likes of Forest and Huddersfield would be thwarted by defeat in the Merseyside derby. 2 points taken off Coventry City and West Ham would be offset by a 5-match winless run either side of Christmas. That aforementioned run included the ending of a fabled 2-year undefeated streak at Anfield, as Leeds United slalomed into title viewing with victory on Merseyside. Liverpool, on the other hand, were laid strewn in mid-table. As soon as the fog of January cleared, however, Liverpool clicked into gear. First, a 4-1 thrashing of Crystal Palace on January the 29th, and thanks to the return of John Toshak up front, Liverpool embarked on a sequence of 21 consecutive home victories that impacted both this and the following season's title race. Arsenal were the reigning and defending double champions of England, and that was in spite of missing key player Charlie George. So with the talisman's return, Arsenal were feasibly even stronger this time around, even if first team coach Don Howe did take a promotion by earning his first job in management at West Brom. At first it didn't seem to matter. Chelsea were thrashed 3-0 and Huddersfield comfortably humbled shortly after. Then the Gunners started to fire blanks. The early pace setters of Manchester United and Sheffield United took the Arsenal scalp, so too did Stoke City at Highbury. Defensive footing was finally found when the trio of Leeds, Leicester and Newcastle visited North London, whilst visits to the Hawthorns, the Dell and Stamford Bridge proved more fruitful, and was largely owed to the shot in the arm of Charlie George's return. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the buoyancy of European Cup football finally turning up at Highbury. Ray Kennedy was certainly in the continental mood as he bagged goals in 3 of Arsenal's first 4 ties in the competition, as the Gunners fired themselves into the quarter-finals after the winter break. They'd face ever so slightly greater opposition though, on the other side of Christmas. A tough November, however, saw to just 3 points, with defeats in succession to Liverpool, Man City and Wolves, before only a point was gleaned from White Hart Lane. Out of the black though came more comfortable fixtures either side of Christmas, and a November the 27th win over Crystal Palace reignited the Gunners' season. 12 games unbeaten in the league had Arsenal firmly entrenched in the title race, just in time for the European Cup to resume. Suddenly, with the continent back on the plate, Arsenal couldn't find the appetite for a goal back home, going down in 3 successive away games at Main Road, St James's Park and Elland Road. It could be said that the allure of the European Cup cost them the league title. The 1969 champions of England were the favourites for the championship. They were well stocked in every position and experienced to boot, without much change from the notorious team of the 60s that was built to perfection by the perfectionist himself, Don Revie. But they had to start their season with 4 quote-unquote home matches being played away from Elland Road. A further sting was that if any game fell below Leeds' average attendance, the club would have to recompensate the visiting team. So under the severe handicap, as Revie called it, Leeds started the season under duress. The manager was found complaining after a 3-0 defeat at Bramall Lane against Sheffield United, where Leeds were denied 3 penalties. Whilst they had initiated the season well with victory over Manchester City, they dropped points in their first home games. First came a goalless draw at Huddersfield's Leeds Road Stadium against Wolves before another stalemate with Spurs at Hull's Boothbury Park. Those games would ultimately constitute half of Leeds' drop points in home fixtures. Further to that dismay, Leeds looked to be going through in Europe after a 2-0 triumph in Belgium against Lens in the UEFA Cup. That was until a 6-minute triple salvo from the Belgians back in Yorkshire panicked Leeds, and they were picked off 4-0 on the counter. They were eliminated at the same stage as Southampton, who put up more of a fight in their first round encounter against Athletic Club. Leeds finally returned home in mid-September, Peter Lorimer winning the tie against Liverpool, but away form plagued Leeds throughout the autumn, losing at Highbury, Leeds Road, Highfield Road and the Dell. They weren't aided by 10 fixtures in September that included a needless playoff organised by UEFA with Barcelona. It was a match to determine who would keep the now defunct Fairs Cup. The game, as well as its much-needed gate receipts, allowed Leeds to recoup some of the money lost by their 4 home games that took place away from Elland Road. Torment wasn't far around the corner, however, as they looked as though they had signed the long-term replacement for Johnny Giles. Asa Hartford was earmarked and his £177,000 transfer from West Bromwich Albion was announced, only for his medical to discover a hole in the heart. Leeds weren't willing to take the risk as Hartford played on professionally until 1991, featured 50 times for Scotland, including at 2 World Cups, and remained in the top flight of English football until 1985. Christmas neared, Lorimer's output in front of goal rocketed up and Leeds barraged through the divisions. Both Manchester clubs, Everton, Leicester, Stoke, Nottingham Forest and West Brom all laid in Leeds' wake as Lorimer netted in all 7 wins. Before we delve back into the club game, the England national team was at a serious crossroads, as if the 1971-72 season wasn't dramatic enough. They had to fend off the likes of Switzerland and Greece in qualification for Euro 1972, but Sir Alf Ramsey was hampered in the autumn of 71 by a glut of League Cup replays that kept out the duo of Gordon Banks and Martin Shivers. Due to a late September win in Basel, a point was all that was required from the 3 Lions, and it was achieved. Needing to avoid a 3-goal defeat in Athens, England scraped through Billy Bingham's Greece with a win. However, the age of the 8-team European Championships was still a full 4 years away, so England had to make do with a 2-legged quarter-final 2 months out from the tournament to book their place. In a field that contained Hungary and Romania just as it boasted Italy and West Germany, England received the worst possible draw. West Germany were due at Wembley. Not only was the prize of Euro 1972 participation on the line, but the carrot of hosting the tournament was as well. Some managers helped Sir Alf Ramsey out by resting their players. Bobby Moore and Jeff Hurst were omitted by West Ham, Alan Ball and Peter Storey likewise for Arsenal. Brian Clough, however, took the direct opposite approach and ruled both Colin Todd and Roy McFarland out, only to play them 2 days after the first leg at Wembley. McFarland was earmarked to partner Bobby Moore in defence, so in his absence, Norman Hunter was deployed. The expected tight defensive game from West Germany proved nothing of the sort on the hallowed turf as Gunter Netzer destroyed the English. The visitors' 3-1 win over the hosts, who were still attached to 5 of their 1966 World Cup final starters, proved the beginning of the end for Ramsey. The game was Jeff Hurst's last in an England shirt. Bobby Moore conceded a penalty and Gordon Banks was at fault for 2 of the goals. In one swift movement, 3 legendary international careers were curtailed. The 0-0 reverse leg in Germany mattered little, as England's hosts were just as comfortable dispatching of them as they were Belgium and the Soviet Union at the Euros that summer. Now back to the club game and the other headlines from a dizzying season. Chelsea slightly underachieved in 7th place in what proved a bizarre season, first and foremost for Dave Webb. Webb could play any number of positions, just as comfortable in defence as he was up front, but very few expected him to play a full 90 minutes in goal against Ipswich Town. If you were insane to predict that, then nobody believed he would keep a clean sheet. Furthermore, Webb netted both goals in a win in the reverse fixture later on in the season. Ipswich was saddled with a safe 13th place finish themselves, despite calls for Bobby Robson's resignation. Ultimately, he would begin building his great Ipswich team with the signing of Alan Hunter, but for now, the progression was gradual. Converging to a point above them were the promoted Leicester City, who stemmed their apparent freefall out of the division with the signings of Alan Birchenall and Keith Weller. Stoke City's focusing on the League Cup rendered them to the lower reaches of the table, but never threatened by the drop, much like Ron Greenwood's West Ham, who underperformed despite the talents of Bobby Moore and Jeff Hurst, as well as Clyde Best, who Greenwood remarked could be as big as Pele or Eusebio. By the 1975 FA Cup final, Best couldn't even make the bench. The other promoted club, Sheffield United, outperformed all of them in a stunning top-half finish in 10th place with 46 points. They might well have had Europe on the mind had Trevor Hockey not suffered a broken leg against Manchester City in February. It blunted the blades as they won just 2 of the next 12. The relegation race was made up of 4 teams for the most part. Huddersfield Town, over-reliant on the goals of Frank Worthington, won what could have been a crucial October contest with fellow strugglers Nottingham Forest. In the end, their last league win came in November. Despite Crystal Palace's best efforts to make a fight out of relegation and Southampton being mired in the same swamp, neither Forest nor Huddersfield could clamber to safety. The English drama wasn't consigned just to the league, as the League Cup produced 2 equally dramatic semi-finals laced with pure drama. When West Ham and Stoke City met for a semi-final first leg, nobody could believe that the tie would be an epic spanning almost 2 months. West Ham took the first spoils 2-1 in East London as Jeff Hurst beat Gordon Banks from the spot. The second leg of the Victoria Ground went to extra time, with Stoke prevailing 1-0 as Gordon Banks' penalty save from Jeff Hurst prolonged the tie. Without the away goals rule, the third match was played at Old Trafford, and when that contest was stalemated, the 2 clubs returned to the mud bath in Salford for a 4th tie which simply had to be settled. In a tie full of decisive penalty kicks, the most dramatic was reserved for the 4th and final encounter as Bobby Moore saved a spot kick, a story in of itself only for the rebound to be swept in. After 11 games which factored in a replay in the 3rd round, 2 replays in the 4th round and 4 semi-final matches, Stoke City were in the final after the best League Cup match of all time won 3-2. Whilst the other semi, which pitted Chelsea against Tottenham, didn't have an epic runtime, it proved a short and lovable piece of art in its own case. Chris Garland and John Hollins staged a memorable 3-2 comeback at Stamford Bridge's first leg, but when it seemed a replay would be needed here, Alan Hudson's free kick squirmed past Pat Jennings. Consequently, the final between Stoke and Chelsea at Wembley could never live up to the billing. Tony Waddington proved the winning manager after 12 years in charge at Stoke City. He had taken them from the cusp of the 3rd division to the club's first trophy in over 100 years, thanks to the good youth recruitment and a shrewd eye for a signing. This included the match winner at Wembley, George Eastham, who Waddington had recruited for just £35,000 in 1966. And before we reached the dramatic denouement of the First Division season, a whistle-stop tour of Europe. Liverpool would return to the European stage in the Cup Winners' Cup in a great field that included Bayern Munich, Barcelona, Chelsea, Rangers, Torino, Sporting, Red Star Belgrade and Dynamo Moscow. The Reds would overturn a famous Servette win in Switzerland but couldn't do the same as the legs were reversed against Bayern Munich in the last 16. That proved the same stage of elimination as Chelsea, meekly bowing out on away goals to Swedish outfit at Videberg. Rangers, however, would win the tournament despite losing a penalty shootout in the last 16 to Sporting, which was ruled null and void since Rangers actually won the match on away goals. Via Torino and Bayern, Rangers romped into a 3-0 lead at a barely full Camp Nou in the final against Dynamo Moscow. Whilst the Soviets had the Glaswegians sweating, Rangers prevailed to finally lift European silverware. Celtic unfortunately couldn't match them, defeated in the European Cup semi-final on penalties to Inter in a bout of revenge for Lisbon 5 years prior. By that point, English representation in the competition had been quashed. Arsenal's quarter-final with Ajax had begun in the brightest possible manner thanks to Ray Kennedy's intercepting of a loose defensive pass inside 15 minutes in the Dutch capital. Then, Ajax turned the heat up. They ought to have won by more than one goal in Amsterdam and found a toothless Arsenal in the Highbury return leg. George Graham's own goal on 15 minutes ended the game as a contest as Ajax won their third European Cup in succession. English interest, however, had turned to the UEFA Cup, where Wolves had seen off Juventus and Spurs cruise through the quarter-finals. Steve Perryman was Spurs' hero, netting as he did in both legs of a semi-final against Milan, whilst Wolves had goalkeeper Phil Parkes to thank for his penalty saves against Ferencváros. It marked the first all-English final in any European competition and guaranteed an 11th English winner of European competition in the decade since Spurs first won England's European gold in 1963. Spurs would lift silverware here too, Martin Shivers netting 2 away goals in Molineux's first leg, before Alan Mullery's return to Spurs was marked by his being knocked unconscious after scoring Spurs' third goal of the tie at White Hart Lane. A nervy end for the North London club, but Spurs prevailed and became the first English club to win 2 separate European trophies. Back home, Spurs wouldn't taste success, being edged out by Leeds and Jack Charlton in the FA Cup quarter-final. Elsewhere in the competition, replay specialist Stoke City felt both edges of the sword, picking off Manchester United after 2 games in the quarter-finals, but faced elimination in the semi-final second outing against Arsenal. Leeds, meanwhile, had a slightly safer route to the final, dispatching of the informed Bob Latchford and Birmingham City. The eventually promoted team petitioned for the match to be moved from Hillsborough, a stadium significantly closer to Leeds, and a stadium in which Don Revie's team had officially played a home match that season. The 3-0 scoreline suggests that any stadium move wouldn't have made a blind bit of difference. Leeds' triumph in the FA Cup marked a 10th different winner in 10 years, thanks to Alan Clark breaking up the lengthy periods of scrappy football with the second half winner. The streak of different FA Cup winners would extend to 13 years in this period. Whilst many critics lament the modern day's closed shop of a dwindling pool of teams with the ability to win, had the 2023 FA Cup final had a different winner, then we would currently be on the second longest streak of different cup winners since the 71-72 season. And finally, the complicated main event mess that was the title race to see who would be crowned champions of England in 1972. Whilst the early pace was set by Sheffield United and Manchester United, they wouldn't last, and neither would Arsenal as the list of contenders shrunk down to 4 by April. You could throw a blanket over each of Derby County, Manchester City, Liverpool and Leeds. Leeds and Liverpool were hitting the pace at the perfect time. The club from the correct side of the Pennines slapped 18 goals in 3 matches beyond Manchester United, Southampton and Nottingham Forest before crashing Arsenal out of the title race. Meanwhile, Liverpool barraged through Newcastle, Southampton and Stoke. Derby's own head of steam culminated in one of the most important matches of the season, the visit of Leeds United on April the 1st. John O'Hare and a Norman Hunter own goal found the net that turned the season on its head and sent Derby top. Ultimately though, Leeds were still favourites to win the league owing to their experience. However, with just 2 home games remaining and poor away form, their position was an increasingly precarious one. Yet despite strong-arming their way back into the title race, Brian Clough seemed dead set on handicapping his own team. He put Derby front and centre of a bizarre tug-of-war with Manchester United over Ian Storey-Moore. The player had refused United's deal and accepted Derby's, yet Forest hadn't accepted Derby's bid. Despite being paraded around the baseball ground pitch prior to a Derby match and announced as a Derby County player, Storey-Moore would wind up at United. With that pound-shop version of the Alfredo Di Stefano 1953 transfer out of the way, Brian Clough went about openly courting the Coventry City job despite the club languishing in the lower reaches. Both Clough and his assistant Peter Taylor resigned in late April, only it proved a long game to get a wage rise after the long-suffering spendthrift chairman Sam Longson. The title race still had many bends to navigate. The 10-1 outsiders for the title, Liverpool staked a claim with a 3-0 thrashing at Old Trafford on the same night that Derby undid their hard work against Leeds by losing to Newcastle. Not to be outdone, Manchester City couldn't return to the top as they lost to Stoke City thanks to an agonisingly late miss from Francis Lee. The signing of Rodney Marsh had left City suddenly stodgy up front, and with Wyn Davies' shooting boots evading him, City were bereft. Added to this, Joe Corrigan would miss the rest of the season through injury. The signing therefore of Marsh wasn't the only reason for City's demise, proven as they bounced back from a draw at Newcastle and defeat at lowly Southampton by earning victories over West Ham and Manchester United. Just as they looked to fling themselves back into contention, Derby and Leeds recorded rare wins on their travels, dispatching of Sheffield United and Stoke City respectively, whilst Liverpool's insatiable form continued. It left the four teams separated by 2 points with 3 games to play. On April the 15th, Derby and Liverpool recorded simple wins over Huddersfield and West Ham, whilst Malcolm Allison earmarked the worst possible time to find a coy side. All set to continue at the top of the league, the manager instructed his team to sit off and play for a 1-0 win over Coventry. They were then undone defensively, conceding late and dropping into second. The staggered fixture list only served to enhance the drama as Manchester City played their penultimate fixture a full 3 weeks before Leeds and Liverpool wrapped up their season. 3 days after being held by Coventry, City travelled to Portman Road, a ground that City hadn't won at for 11 years. Another draw put the final nail in City's coffin thanks to the upcoming fixture between Derby and Liverpool, as well as their inferior goal average. Leeds had every right to be confident, but a winner from Newcastle United's Malcolm McDonald 9 minutes from time kept them rooted to 4th place the following day. Suddenly the favourites had become the rank outsiders at 3-1, whilst Derby's 5-4 odds made them favourites. And although Manchester City picked off Derby County thanks to a man-of-the-match display from Rodney Marsh to go top, their poor goal average counted against them, officially eliminated from contention. John Toshak's double for Liverpool against Ipswich saw to that, whilst this time Leeds were aided by poor officiating against West Brom, as Johnny Giles netted a tamely awarded penalty. Manchester City's season was over, but Derby County's was only just beginning. Their season would end with the May Day visit of Liverpool to the baseball ground, where a win was imperative. Leeds meanwhile hosted Chelsea in a replay of the 1970 FA Cup final. Their 2-0 triumph, courtesy of Billy Bremner and Mick Jones, threw the cat amongst the pigeons, whilst Brian Clough's perpetually unsung hero John McGovern bagged the all-important winner against Liverpool. And still, the season wasn't remotely finished. Only 2 meaningful fixtures remained in the season. Liverpool's travel to Highbury whilst Leeds hosted Wolves. This 2 days after both Leeds and Arsenal had slugged out an FA Cup final at Wembley. Leeds were made favourites by the bookies, but if anybody had the momentum, form and freshness, it was Liverpool. They hadn't lost since defeat to Leicester on January the 8th, a match in which Liverpool last conceded away from home. The permutations were as follows. Leeds needed a win to be absolutely sure, however a point would likely do it thanks to their superior goal average. Meanwhile, Liverpool needed a win in the hope that Leeds lost. Despite winning the title as it stood from the moment the whistle blew to begin proceedings at Elland Road, Leeds went for the kill early on as 2 penalty claims were turned down. Then, before the half was out, Wolves' Frank Munro smashed one in off the post to upset the Leeds apple cart. Meanwhile, Arsenal were living dangerously as Emlyn Hughes thwacked an effort off the underside of the bar for Liverpool. With Derby back on top of the league, Leeds desperately threw men forward, only to be countered by Derek Dougan on 67 minutes. Billy Bremner would claw a goal back, but the second was not to be found. Therefore, the onus laid at Liverpool's doorstep to find the goal that would take the title away from Derby County. As time ebbed out of the 71-72 season, John Toshak found the net with his 14th and final goal of the season for Liverpool, only for the flag to be raised for offside. And with the wind removed from the Liverpool sails, both games at Highbury and Elland Road petered out without another goal to be found. Listening to it all unfold was Peter Taylor and the Derby team in Mallorca, whilst Clough holidayed in the Scilly Isles with his family. Derby County were champions of England for the first time. Their title win was the 7th different English champion in 7 years, as Leeds contrived to finish second for the 5th time in 8 seasons. For Manchester City and Liverpool, a marked improvement, but still not good enough to claim anything from a gut-wrenching season. The 1971-72 season was a catalyst for change for many, whilst for others it marked the long road of decline. Manchester United's decline in the haze of Sir Matt Busby's retirement was set in stone by the mid-70s as each of the Holy Trinity departed and the club were relegated. Whilst they would bounce back into the top flight immediately and win the FA Cup under Tommy Docherty's management, the period remains a stain on United's history. Not to be outdone, Tommy Docherty's former employers Chelsea also suffered a sharp decline from the heady days of title races and cup finals. Peter Osgood himself has marked the 71-72 season as the campaign where the club went downhill. From the loss of the League Cup final to Stoke City, the sale of Keith Weller and his own protracted time on the transfer list did the club no good. The subsequent decade was a period of yo-yoing between the top two divisions, only to return permanently to the top tier when the Premier League was just around the corner. To a lesser extent, Arsenal declined too, although not immediately. They mounted a title challenge the following year which proved fruitless against an extraordinary Liverpool team. By the turn of the decade, it could be said that they were merely a less successful Tottenham Hotspur. They weren't threatening the upper echelons of the league, and whilst they reached plenty of cup finals, they won just one out of 4 in 3 seasons, including 3 FA Cup finals on the spin and the Cup Winners' Cup final defeat to Valencia in 1980. Newcastle United's lack of a trophy for a few years became an elongated drought from which the club still suffers through to this day. They were manhandled in Bill Shankly's final match as Liverpool manager in the 1974 FA Cup final and went down to Manchester City 2 years later in the League Cup. 2 years beyond that, and the 1969 Fairs Cup triumph seemed a whole of a world away when Newcastle slipped into the second division. Meanwhile, in Derby, Brian Clough reached the edge of success on the continent as they attempted to thoroughly back up their claims that the 1971-72 league victory wasn't a fluke. They were controversially dispatched from a European Cup semi-final by Juventus and questionable officiating. When Clough finally departed, Derby's success didn't relent, winning the league once more in 1975 under former player Dave Mackay, just as Clough inaugurated his greatest empire in nearby Nottingham. His arch-rival Don Revie wouldn't be long for Leeds and subsequently English club football. Unlike Shankly, Revie wasn't able to successfully rebuild his squad prior to his leaving of Elland Road in 1974, when the national job came calling. His successor was the diametrically opposed Brian Clough, who lasted a mere 44 days. What followed was a slew of big-name managers and former players attempting to recapture the lightning in a bottle that Revie had done, but they couldn't stop Leeds dropping into the second tier. Contrastingly, Ipswich Town went from strength to strength. Bobby Robson survived by the skin of his teeth in Suffolk, and the beginnings of a great team were created in the 71-72 season. The Tractor Boys' gradual rise as title challengers to FA Cup winners in 1978 didn't show any signs of slowing, as Robson almost landed a spectacular treble in 1981, settling for the club's only continental honour, the UEFA Cup. Tottenham Hotspur's status as a good cup team never truly relented thanks to consecutive successes in the FA Cup at the start of the 80s. Not shy of a good cup fairy tale, Spurs returned to the UEFA Cup final on multiple occasions, claiming their second trophy in the competition in 1984. As a true mark of their place in English football, Spurs wouldn't return to the First Division's top 3 until 1985. Wolves finally lifted their first trophy since the days of Stan Cullis with the League Cup of 1974, but it did nothing to signal the return of the heady days of the 1950s. Wolves faltered at earlier rounds of the UEFA Cup and were relegated in 1976. Whilst they would immediately bounce back, the Old Gold had a rough time of it in the 80s, suffering 4 relegations in 5 years before beginning the long road back to the top in 1987. Everton didn't have such a violent decline after the retirement of Harry Catterick, but it did take a number of years for their return to their manager's former glories. When Howard Kendall, a player in Catterick's title-winning squad, returned as manager, he manufactured a brand new peak at Goodison Park, with multiple cup finals, a triumph on the continent, as well as a couple of league titles in the face of dominance across Stanley Park. On the red half of Merseyside, Bill Shankly cultivated the dominance that allowed for boot room members Joe Fagan and Bob Paisley to be successful throughout the 70s and 80s, before Kenny Dalglish continued that trend on into the 90s. The Shankly foundations laid on 4 European Cups and a domestic dominance that went unrivalled until a certain Alex Ferguson turned up in England.